Hi, I'm Brian Russell, and it's a real privilege to be your guide as we take a deep dive into the book of Philippians over the next couple of weeks. These are introductory videos, and I hope to share with you some vital information that will help you to actually read Philippians in a more robust and powerful way that will bring its life-giving message into your life so you can live it out. I've called this series Living as Citizens Worthy of the Gospel of Christ. As we're going to see, citizenship plays a key role in Philippians, and that's a powerful word for our 21st century as we seek to live out faithfully as Jesus's followers, even though we are also simultaneously citizens of earthly countries, earthly kingdoms, and there's always a tension there. So I want to give you a little bit of background. The Philippian church was founded during Paul's second missionary journey, which is detailed specifically in Acts 16. But before I get there, what I want to remind us of is Philippians comes to us from 60 AD. Okay, so this letter was written almost 2,000 years ago. And interestingly enough, Paul wrote this while he was in prison. You can look at Philippians chapter 1, for example, and Philippians 1, especially verses 12 through 26, detail Paul's reality that he's in prison, and he's able to say, like in verse 12, that what's happened to him has actually helped to spread the gospel even more. He's been able to share faith. Most people believe that Paul wrote this while he was imprisoned in Rome. You can read about that in the later chapters of Acts towards the end of Paul's life. And Paul was able to witness to the person serving in the Roman emperor's guard, and the word of Paul's imprisonment and how Paul endured it inspired other followers of Jesus to be even bold in their proclamation. So Paul talks about that in the beginning of Philippians. So that's the backdrop. So remember when we're reading these words that Paul isn't writing this from some affluent office or far removed from the front lines. Paul is literally writing this as a person who doesn't know if he's going to live or die, and he wants to help this church, the Philippian church, which was very important to Paul, as we'll see later in the letters. The Philippians were a wealthy congregation, and they were supporters of Paul. So they were actually supporting him even while he was in prison by sending him resources. And so part of Philippians is a thank you note for their generosity and an encouragement to the Philippians to continue to be generous. So this comes out of Paul's imprisonment. Now, Philippians, or the city of Philippi, is significant for a couple of different reasons. The city of Philippi was founded by Caesar Augustus, or at least renamed and rebooted by Caesar Augustus. This was the Caesar that followed Julius Caesar, and Caesar Augustus was alive when Jesus was born. And so the Philippi has ancient roots, but Caesar Augustus rebuilt it as a military outpost and declared it to be a Roman colony. Now, what this meant in the ancient world, because Philippi is essentially, and we'll have a map that you can look at, Philippi is directly across the straits that separate Europe, or Macedonia and Greece, from Turkey. And so Philippi is essentially the farthest outpost on the way to Asia, moving from Rome east towards Asia. You can also see Philippi as the first European city that receives the gospel. So it was an important outpost for Caesar Augustus, and it ended up having special privileges as a Roman colony, which included having many of its citizens, many who were former military soldiers, who were actually Roman citizens. Now, most Roman citizens were actually from the city of Rome, or at least from Italy. So it was unusual to have such a large cluster of Roman citizens. As we see as we go into the book, that's going to play a significant role in the way that Paul writes, the language that he used, and the message that he gives, because Roman citizens had special privileges. They had freedoms that other people didn't have. They were exempt from certain taxes. That sounds great, doesn't it? They were able to appeal any sentences directly to the emperor, so they had a final right of repeal. And for example, if you know Paul's life, Paul was a Roman citizen, which was one of the unusual among the apostles. So in the book of Acts, Paul is able to appeal his sentence that he receives back in Palestine all the way to the Roman emperor, and that's how he ends up getting to Rome. So that was significant. So you had the right to appeal beyond the local municipality where you might have gotten in trouble with. So you had real legal protections. And one of the most significant protections, and this is going to become central in the book, is that you were essentially free of cruel punishments and executions. So for example, a Roman citizen couldn't be crucified. We'll see how that plays out later, especially since Paul is proclaiming a crucified God, Jesus Christ. So let's look at Acts 16. How was the church founded? The church was founded again during Paul's second missionary journey. So Paul would have founded the church roughly 50 to 51 AD or CE. So about 10 years before he writes this letter, Paul founds the church. And if you may recall from the book of Acts, when Paul was revisiting churches that he had planted around what today would be modern Turkey, Paul was planning on going back into Turkey, but there's a famous text in chapter 16 that while he was sleeping, he has this vision in which he hears a man from Macedonia calling, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." So Paul takes that as a word from God that he's not supposed to go back into Turkey, but he's supposed to cross the straits and actually take the gospel to what we would now call Europe. And Philippi is essentially a gateway city that leads directly into Europe. And the person that he meets when he crosses the straits and he goes to Philippi, which the Acts 16 calls a leading city of Macedonia and a Roman colony, on the Sabbath, he goes down to a place of prayer and he shares the gospel with a group of women, the most prominent being a woman named Lydia, who was a worshiper of God, who, in other words, she was open to the God of the Scripture. She knew, probably from associations with the synagogue and Jewish persons who lived in Philippi, about Israel's God. And she hears the gospel, and she's a wealthy person. She's a dealer in purple cloth, which was a expensive commodity. So she was essentially an entrepreneur. And the Lord opened up her heart, and she goes into, she invites Paul into her house, and where she and her entire household are baptized. So that's how the city, or how the church starts. So notice some of these themes. This is Paul sharing the gospel with really significant persons. Here in this case, an entrepreneur, Lydia. We've already mentioned that many of the people that end up coming into the Christ-following movement would be Roman citizens, and that women are prominent in the church from early on. We're going to see that the book of Philippians, Paul is actually addressing the leadership of the church that appears to be to women. So it's one of the earliest churches that would have had a significant female leadership in it, which is an important point to note as we think about what's it look like for leadership in our churches today. Well, anyway, that's a little bit about the background. In the next video, I'm going to do a quick overview of the book of Philippians and let you look at an outline and how it fits together. So you can pause now and move on to the next video, or you can consider some of the study questions that we have. Hi, welcome back. It's really important that you engage with the questions that we raise in the study guides and really focus on the text. One of the most important things about reading Scripture is we want to open ourselves up to be astonished by it and to really ponder how those words in the Scriptures can impact our life so that we can connect them back to our relationship with God. How do these texts help us to love God more profoundly? And then also, how do these texts give us a model and teach us how to love our neighbor as ourselves? In other words, how the gospel comes to us on its way to other people and it's on its way to other places. And the book of Philippians is going to model this around a central theme. Again, this study is called Living as Citizens Worthy of the Gospel of Christ. That's going to be the central feature of the book. And I'm going to start here in the middle. When we do an outline, we take a look at the book of Philippians, and I would encourage you to read through the book of Philippians. It's a very short book. It literally probably takes 15 or 20 minutes to read the 4 chapters, but read through it several times if you can. At least read through it all the way once before we begin to work on individual passages. In this short video, I'm going to again go over the outline. We're going to begin with the middle part. The core part of Philippians runs from 127, it's the last paragraph of chapter 1, through the first verse of chapter 4. And this is where the essential exhortation and teaching comes in. 127 reads roughly, only live as citizens worthy of the gospel of Christ. That's my translation of chapter 1, verse 27, at least the first half of verse 27. And that's the core principle that Paul is going to teach about. Again, notice the word citizen shows up. That doesn't show up in every English translation, but the word citizen is the main verb in 127. And then Paul is going to repeat it again down in towards the end in verse 320. He's going to talk about our citizenship is in heaven. So citizenship frames this central piece. And Paul again is teaching, what does it look like to be a person whose ultimate allegiance isn't to Rome or whatever empire that we're part of, and instead finds his or her ultimate allegiance to the gospel of the kingdom, to the good news that we have found in Jesus Christ. And the way Paul is going to teach that is through models. I'm going to say more about modeling specifically in the next introductory video, but Paul lays out 3 models of gospel citizenship. He's going to say in 3:17, he's going to wrap up this whole section by saying, be imitators. And Paul's going to say, be imitators of me. Observe those who have been setting a good example for you. And then he's going to talk about the cross of Christ. And interestingly enough, the way that Paul unfolds this middle section is he talks first, our first model for what's it look like to be a citizen worthy of the gospel. Well, it looks like Jesus. And so there's a famous passage in Philippians that we'll do a deep dive in a week or two. And that's going to be the showing the model of Christ. How Christ, though he was God, takes on the form of a servant and dies on a cross. And then God raises him up and gives him the name above all names, that in the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Powerful model. Well, then Paul makes it a little more gritty, because of course Jesus is a model for gospel citizenship, right? But then Paul talks about his co-workers. In chapter 2, verses 19 to 30, sometimes commentators just talk about this as kind of an aside or a report, but as we're going to see, the language that Paul uses to describe Timothy and his other co-worker Epaphroditus, he uses language and vocabulary that's going to be like some of the same language he uses to describe Jesus, to say, look, you've never met Jesus. It's like we've never met Jesus. But you know who you have met? You've met Timothy. That was Paul's co-worker. And you know Epaphroditus really well. Epaphroditus is thought to have been the person that carried the letter back to Philippi. Epaphroditus was from Philippi, and it's the person that the Philippians sent a gift to Paul through. And so they knew this person. So think about the audacity here. What's it look like to be a citizen worthy of the gospel? Look to Jesus, but you can also look to people that are still living, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And then last, Paul uses himself as an example of what that looks like. And so we're going to see a big section here is going to challenge some of our things that we hold dear even in the 21st century about citizenship, about status, about what really is worthy of praise, and even how to evaluate many of the great things that have happened to us in the past. Because what we're going to see in Philippians, when Paul, especially when Paul talks about himself, he gives us a different kind of a model. The Christ following movement, again, many people come to the gospel when they've been in extremely difficult circumstances. But a lot of people, and like Lydia, she was a wealthy entrepreneur. She came into the gospel with the gospel as a very successful person. So did Paul. And so Paul's going to talk about how do we think about our past, whether it was a great past or a challenging past, in a way that sets us up to live lives that model Jesus Christ for other people. So that's this whole middle section. Now let's back it up. Paul's going to start his letter like most of Paul's letters. Paul starts with a greeting. He's going to pray for the Philippians, and then he's going to describe the circumstances. I mentioned this in the first video. This section here, 1:12 to 26, Paul talks about his imprisonment. Now, what's profoundly interesting about the greeting, again, greetings aren't always that exciting. We want to get to the meat of the letter. But what's interesting about Philippians, the book of Philippians is the only place where Paul only takes the title slave for himself. Paul calls himself, Paul and Timothy, slaves of Christ Jesus. Again, most English translations say servant there, but it's really the word for slave. And he doesn't add apostle to that. He just says slaves. Why would Paul do that? Well, again, who's he writing to? He's writing to privileged Roman citizens, persons of means. And in Roman culture, there was a hierarchy that ran through the ancient world. And Paul wants to subvert that, because one of the lessons we're going to see come out of the book of Philippians is this: the status that we embrace, if we think we're better than certain other types of people, is going to set the limits on our capacity to reach other people for the gospel. And so it's interesting that Paul takes the lowest status available in the ancient world, which was slave, as his title. Now, here's the incredible part of this. There's going to be one other person who takes the status of slave in Philippians, and you can guess who that's going to be. It's going to be Jesus. In 2:7, it says that Jesus emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. And so Philippians is going to talk about a way of life in which we're willing to relinquish any claims to status, rights, privileges as a means for putting ourselves in a position that God can use us to bless other people. And profoundly, Jesus' model is Jesus goes from God divine to slave, and then God raises him up and gives him the name that's above all names. Powerful model. The status that we embrace sets the limits on our ability and capacity to reach other people for the gospel. If we want to live first class, we may only be able to reach people in first class. Paul calls himself a slave. Paul's willing to relinquish his rights and privileges so that he can reach others for the gospel. We'll talk more about that as we go, because Paul's going to say only live as a citizen worthy of the gospel. The last section, which is roughly chapter 4, it's other than the first verse that goes in this middle section. In the last section of Philippians, Paul's going to give 5 takeaways, 5 applications of this new way of citizenship. He's going to talk about being united. He's going to talk about how to be joyful in all circumstances. He's going to teach how do you practice virtue? How do you practice virtue, and how do you live in a way that regardless of what's going on around you, you can continue to grow in virtue and in your faith. He's going to exhort the Philippians to continue to be generous, and then he's going to give some closing greetings. So that's the book of Philippians. What part do you think looks to be the most interesting? What sounds like it might be challenging to you? We're going to spend a few minutes talking about this outline and some things that you heard that you want to remember. So pause, and then you can go on to the next video. In this video, I want to give a Wesleyan reading of the book of Philippians. And I want to cover 5 areas: gratitude, Christ-centered piety, sanctification as kingdom citizenship, missional unity, and audacious imitation. When you read through the book of Philippians, and again, if you're doing the course with me, I would encourage you to read through it several times. Take the time, and it will pay off for you immensely. It's more important that you even read the text and listen to me talk about the text. So what's going on in Philippians? Well, some of the themes that it teaches are gratitude. Paul starts off in the initial chapter in his prayer, "I thank God every time I remember you, constantly praying with joy in every one of my prayers." And so Paul, the book of Philippians, Paul is filled with gratitude and with joy. And it's interesting that this whole business about thank you not only permeates the letter, but actually frames it out. If you go back and look at the outline in the previous video, Paul ends with a thank you note to the Philippians about their generosity and expresses his gratitude and encourages them to continue to be generous. But there's a modeling of gratitude here. And so the Philippians, again, a wealthy congregation. It's a Roman colony, many Roman citizens. We know Lydia was an entrepreneur who started this out. So this is a church of some means. They were supporters of Paul. And Paul models that attitude of gratitude that needs to permeate our theology, our ethic, and our virtue. And in a Wesleyan reading, that's an important word for us, especially if you're in a place of means in your own life. John Wesley gave that advice: earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And in a sense, we had to connect a couple of purpose statements in there. Earn all you can so that you can save all you can. And Wesley advocated living essentially a minimalist life so that you can build resources so that then you can give to the work of the proclamation of the gospel and to the easing of human suffering. So that's important. So Philippians models a spirit of gratitude that moves out in stewardship of resources for the support of the gospel in our day. The second thing that we see here is a Christ-centered, vital piety. When we get to chapter 3, we're going to see Paul talk about his own life and how it was completely transformed simply by knowing Christ, and that put everything else in perspective for him. He considers everything else a loss. And what Paul considers loss were not the bad stuff in his life. Paul considers loss the things that gave him privilege, the things that gave him pride, the things that gave him esteem and status in the eyes of other persons. Paul calls those things loss, except for the surpassing greatness of knowing Jesus Christ and becoming like him so that he too might attain the resurrection of the dead. That's a powerful Christ-centered piety. And Paul is going to again describe how the life of Jesus himself and then also how Paul's co-workers model that. So there's a Christ-centered piety that's transformational. And it's a Christ-centered piety that can be lived out and embraced by us living today. The third thing that Paul talks about is sanctification, holiness as kingdom citizenship. Paul boils down his message essentially in 127, where he says only this: live as citizens worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Be transformed. Take on the model of Jesus. That's what holiness is about. It's to become more and more Christ-like. So it's not to just have a Christ-centered piety, but it's also to embrace the mind of Christ, have that same attitude of Christ. Paul's going to say things in chapter 3. I press on towards the goal to win the prize of the upward calling of God in Christ Jesus. He's going to talk about having the same mind, doing nothing out of selfish ambition, but embracing humility. He's going to talk about working out our salvation with fear and trembling. Again, that's not about works righteousness, but it's about being shaped. One of my favorite metaphors is in chapter 2, verses 15, so that you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation in which you shine like stars. We need holiness in our lives so that we can shine like stars. And again, imagine a black sky, not the stars in a city if you live in a city, but go out in the country where it's really dark and watch how those stars, they just pop off the night sky. That's what Paul's talking about. That's what holiness does. And we live as citizens worthy of the kingdom when we shine like stars in the darkness. Big part of Philippians is how do you stay unified? And in this case, we see different things in Paul's letters. Like in Corinthians, there was disunity over significant issues that were theological. It looks like in Philippians, there's some doctrinal issues, which we'll talk about, but also the church in Philippi was under persecution. So Paul is calling the church to be of the same mind. And in fact, it looks like the leadership of the church in this case is divided. Mentioned in the previous video how Paul called himself a slave. It's interesting that he addresses, after he calls himself a slave, he mentions bishops and deacons or overseers and deacons in verse 1. And it looks like the leaders were divided. It looks like in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, Paul is directly addressing the leaders, Judea and Syntyche, who were women who looks like they were leading the church at Philippi, to have the same mind. So it's critical for the church to come together, standing firm in the face of the world that was pressing in on them, and that serves as a witness of this. So Philippians is interesting in a missional unity that can stand firm in the face of persecution, and it can stand firm by coming together around a Christ-centered, sanctified life as a way of overcoming even some of the doctrinal disputes that they seem to have been having. And then the fifth thing that shows up, and this is vital for a Wesleyan reading, is audacious imitation. Again, I find it remarkable that Paul says, be imitators of me. Pay attention to my co-workers, how they lived. And then he talks about the cross of Jesus. I mentioned this in the previous video, but this is a key piece. What would it look like for us to be able to look somebody in the face, maybe even a person that's sitting across the table with you in the study, and say, imitate my life because I am following after Jesus Christ? How many of us have that audacity or even that conviction that we're living in such a way that we could say, hey, you know what, if you want to see what it looks like to be a Christian, just look at me. Look at me. You know, we live in a world where everybody on social media is trying to get attention saying, look at me. And a lot of what people are calling us to look at is really just reminders of brokenness and doubt and hurt and pain. Paul was saying, look at me, imitate me. One of my hopes for this study is this will empower you wherever you are to have such a powerful encounter with Jesus and experience such levels of transformation that you can then say, look at me, and we can begin to mentor and live out and model what it looks like to be Jesus' hands, feet, mouthpieces in the world and become ambassadors of the abundance that we have in the gospel. Just do this one thing. Live as citizens worthy of the gospel. That's some Wesleyan themes that come out of the book of Philippians. Engage the questions and have some conversation around these things before you go. I want to thank you so much for watching my first week of this study on Philippians. I've prepared actually 4 weeks on the book. If you'd be interested in using this study and also receiving the study guide that goes with it, you can reach out to me at deepdivespirituality@gmail.com. Again, that's deepdivespirituality@gmail.com.